All right, and welcome in. My name is Connor Riley. This is Connor in Coverage. We do this every Tuesday night. Hopefully the internet is holding up and working well this time. I think I finally got it fixed, and we know what the solution is now. So hopefully you guys are watching on YouTube. If you're watching the streamed on Twitter or Twitch, or not Twitter, Facebook or Twitch after the fact, come hang out. We're going to do this live at 8 o'clock now on YouTube. We get done with UGA player interviews. We've got clips tonight from Trayvon Walker, Warren McClendon, and Justin Schaefer. You're going to hear from all those guys on this program, as well as Kirby Smart. We're going to talk a little Georgia practice. We're going to talk a little Georgia recruiting, given Georgia's doing very well there. We've got Todd Monken off the top. We've got a fun little analogy there for you. We're going to do Trayvon Walker in the second segment. Touch on UGA recruiting there at the end of the show. Then obviously take your questions. You can follow me on Twitter at KConnorRiley. Right now we're on YouTube. Sort of talking things Georgia football, what comes next, what spring practice looks like. We're about halfway done with spring practice now. Georgia finished its 7th practice today, and they will go into practice 8 on Thursday. Practice 15 is the G-Day scrimmage, so essentially they're halfway done with their real practices at this point. I've got a story coming later this week on sort of winners and losers so far to speak of spring practice, who is turning heads, who, and you guys pretty obviously know, and we'll touch on here a little bit. You know, Kenny McIntosh, George Pickens picking up those injuries that sort of slowed them down a little bit there. So we've got a full fun-packed show tonight. We're going to hear from Kirby Smart. We're going to hear from Trayvon Walker. We're going to hear from a couple offensive linemen. It should be a fun show, and let's dive right into it. Our first topic du jour tonight. It's the headline of our show. It's an analogy I sort of workshopped this morning or late last night, and talked about this a little bit with BA today. Todd Monken needs to do his best Billy Beane impression after Georgia has now lost George Pickens for the foreseeable future. You know, there's still the potential, and Kirby Smart said he hopes that George can come back to play in how he comes back, but even if he does come back to play this season, and I know Jalen Waddle didn't have the same injury, but you just saw he was not the same explosive playmaker that he was prior to that ankle injury he suffered this season. And with George, you can't expect him right away 8 months out of an injury to be that same player. And even if you look at the Georgia roster, Dominic Blaylock and Zamir White, they were not the same player right away, and unfortunately for both those guys, they re-injured their knees. White, the obvious other ACL, and Dominic, the same ACL. So Georgia's going to be careful and cautious with George, because ultimately George, at the end of the day, he's got to look out what's best for him as well here. So I don't expect a whole lot out of George Pickens, and the reality is Georgia cannot replace what George Pickens did in a strictly ideological sense there. There was not another receiver that has the talent on Georgia's roster that George Pickens has. There's not a receiver right now as currently constituted that I think has the same potential that Pickens did for this coming season. And I mentioned Billy Beane here, and some of you, isn't he the GM for the Oakland A's, president, runs Oakland? What does he really have to do with Todd Monken and Georgia in this situation scenario here? Well, I bring all this up because one of my favorite books, actually it's not even one of my favorite books, but it's just a book I read, a great sports book. It's called Moneyball, The Art of Winning an Unfair Game. And Moneyball has obviously revolutionized the way baseball and really analytics as a whole has impacted sports. But the initial problem that Billy Beane, the at the time general manager of the Oakland Athletics, was really setting out and trying to solve was, how does he go about replacing Jason Giambi and then obviously Johnny Damon and Jason Isringhausen, their star players that left in free agency? How do you go about replacing their production when you can't physically replicate their own talent? And really the biggest and toughest guy that I believe 2002 or 2003 Oakland A's team had to replace was Jason Giambi. He was an MVP candidate, signed with the Yankees for a lot of money, was a very good player for them as well. And there's just no real on-roster replacement for him. So what did Oakland do? They said, all right, we can't replace the talent that Jason Giambi was, much like Georgia can't right now replace the talent that Pickens is. And I think Jermaine Burton, Kyrus Jackson are going to be really good receivers, but they don't have, as of right now, the ceiling that George Pickens did within this 2021 season. So how does Georgia, much like the Oakland A's and Billy Beane did all those years ago, how does Georgia go about replacing the production that George Pickens brought to the field? I wish I had done the full screen, but I don't have it with me right now. Over the course, if you expand George Pickens' numbers with JT Daniels at quarterback over the course of a 12-game season, it comes out to roughly 69 catches, 1,173 yards and 12 touchdowns. How do you get that number or those numbers and split it up around the rest of the team so those guys sort of rise the tide a little bit? And how do you do that to where you can at least, while maybe not the threat of George Pickens on the field, you can replace the production that he brought? That means a little bit more touches for Darnell Washington, Jermaine Burton, Arian Smith, Kearis Jackson. So as Kirby Smart and this Georgia offense sort of go about now solving the problem of no longer having George Pickens on this team, they're going to have to get a little creative, and specifically Todd Monken is. And I thought when Kirby spoke last Thursday, he had two really telling comments about Monken and sort of where this offense goes and how they're going to have to go about replacing George Pickens and the production that he brought. Maybe George comes back for those college football playoff games, but until then, and really, obviously part of the problem with the Oakland A's is, as great as replacing that production is over the course of a regular season, it always seems in playoffs when you just don't have that talent to really come through, that's part of the reason they always come up short. George may come back for the college football playoff for an SEC championship game potentially, so Georgia might still one day get that talent back again, but at least in the course of the regular season, they're going to have to find a way to replace the production that Pickens brought. And, Kirby Smart was asked about this last week. How do you go about doing this? What does it look like? And I thought he gave a very good answer, and one that pretty squarely says, hey, this is something that Todd Monken is going to have to figure out, and we have a lot of faith and confidence that Todd is going to be the guy for that. Here's what Kirby had to say about it last week.
Take your best 11 football players, and you try to find ways that, that could be one back, three tight end. That could be three back, one tight end. That could be five wides, no backs, no tight ends. You find your best football players, and you find ways to get them the ball, and that's what I think Coach Monken does a great job of. So he's going to try to exploit whoever you're playing's weaknesses, and he's going to try to use our strengths to do that with. We have plays we call that are the same plays that we call in all personnel groupings. It's just another way to get another guy the ball, another playmaker the ball. So we lost a guy who's a pretty good playmaker, but we've got other guys we think are good playmakers, and we'll just try to find ways to get them the ball. Take your best 11 football.
So you hear Kirby there talk about it just a little bit, and so obviously wide receiver Jermaine Burton is someone who's going to see an uptick. Kearis Jackson, Arian Smith is going to do it as well, and sort of what that looks like there is going to be really interesting in how Georgia goes about doing it. But there's another part of the equation that I think needs to be solved and figured out here, and that is, how does the other parts of this Georgia offense, the running backs and the tight ends, get involved as well? I thought Kirby had another very interesting answer on that. Here's what Kirby had sort of said about those other pieces of the Georgia offense now getting involved, especially more now that George Pickens is out.
Yeah, it really puts it on everybody. I mean, I think Brock Bowers, I think Darnell, Fitz, James, Amir, Dejon, Kendall. I mean, you got a lot of guys that, we'll try to find ways to get the ball to them. So I don't look at it as a receiver. So, but Rosamy's rehabbing. He's been out there doing walkthroughs, coaching the young receivers. He's really into it. Dom, very smart, understands it, and he's rehabbing as well. So both those guys are running and doing things, but they're not cleared to practice yet. Yeah, it really puts it on everybody.
And as naturally we mentioned all that, there has been a little bit of breaking news here. Dog Nation's Mike Griffith can report Georgia wide receiver Jermaine Burton was carted off the practice field on Tuesday. I'm reading his story right now, which you can read on Dog Nation. The injury could be a hyperextended knee, according to a source with knowledge of the practice. The extent or possibility of ligament damage was not known at this time. Georgia has not released any sort of information on it at this point in time. It should be noted a week ago it was at this practice that George Pickens unfortunately tore his ACL. So brief little update there on Jermaine Burton, carted off of practice this week. You can read the rest of that story up at dognation.com. And boy, it just seems like the Georgia wide receiver room is pretty snake-bitten right now. They finally looks like they get all the talent you need, or at least would want to have in there. And for Jermaine Burton to go down with, and obviously we don't know the extent of the injury at this point in time. We'll probably learn more about it. Kirby Smart is set to speak to reporters on Saturday. But, I mean, Jermaine Burton really seemed like the guy who was probably going to be your number one wide receiver with George Pickens going down. And now that he's got a knee injury of his own to deal with, certainly concerning and worrying there. You hope he gets and heals up, because he was someone who really, when JT Daniels came in specifically in that Mississippi State game a season ago, he really took off and improved as a playmaker, and he had 197 yards, I believe 2 touchdowns in that Mississippi State game, and was someone who was going to play that X position that George Pickens had occupied. And so you go there and you think, all right, well, Pickens is out. We're still waiting to sort of see what happens with Burton. He was carted off of practice, according to Dog Nation's Mike Griffith. What does that mean for this Georgia wide receiver room going forward? They already have two other wide receivers who could potentially be big-time pieces, but they're working with injuries of their own that they're coming back from. You have Marcus Rosemy-Jacksain, who had that terrible ankle injury in the Florida game, and then Dominic Blaylock, who's coming off his own ACL injury. Kirby Smart had said before, those guys are working, they are running, they are doing straight line speed, they're working their way back, but they're still not ready to go through practice right now. And Kirby Smart was asked earlier this spring, how do you feel about the depth at wide receiver position? They had lost 4 guys to the transfer portal in this offseason, and Kirby had said at that point in time they actually felt pretty good about it. But now you lose Pickens. You're waiting to see sort of what happens with Jermaine Burton and his injury there. It's certainly worrying and concerning. And going forward, you look at this room. Arian Smith is someone who's had an injury history. Karis Jackson missed a lot of time in the 2019 season with a variety of injuries. This wide receiver room is really interesting, and it's going to have to really step up even more now. And you look at a guy like Adonai Mitchell, someone who has turned heads a little bit here since the start of spring practice, was someone who did not play his senior season a year ago, reclassified to the 2021 recruiting class, trained, worked out on his own, and earned a Georgia scholarship, and is someone who has looked good early on. Now, he probably becomes one of the more important pieces of G-Day. Justin Robinson is another name to know. Someone who now, if Jermaine Burton's set to miss at least the rest of spring, you think Justin Robinson is someone who's really going to see a lot of reps at that X position in G-Day on April 17th, and he's someone who, battled injuries of his own last year, had a knee injury earlier this offseason that was limiting him in off-season workouts a little bit. He's got the physical size that you want to see, and Kirby had spoken about him last week, and one of the things there that you wonder, worry, think about is, all right, Justin Robinson has a clear opportunity now. How does he take that next step? Because Kirby had said last Thursday, just isn't always practicing hard. It seems like sometimes he might be saving himself a little bit. And obviously when you have an injury history, I think that's part of the concern there. But to sort of recap here a little bit, Jermaine Burton goes down, leaves practice with a knee injury, had to get carted off, according to Dog Nation's Mike Griffith. We'll have more in this story as it develops. You can read it on the Dog Nation app and Dog Nation site right now as we speak. So obviously it's something where you hope it's not as bad as it seems to be. But again, just Georgia seems really snake-bitten this preseason, with Kenny McIntosh going down with an elbow injury in the first practice. George Pickens obviously tearing his ACL, and now we wait and see what the sort of injury situation is with Jermaine Burton going forward. That's according to Dog Nation's Mike Griffith there. So, man, Billy Beane and Todd Monken, Todd Monken's really going to have to do even more. Now you probably lost Jason Giambi and Johnny Damon. So Georgia's going to have to find it. Scott Hatterberg out there, find a way to manufacture more receiving yards. Obviously, it helps that you have, I think, a running game as good and as talented as you do. With all you bring back, I would expect guys like Kendall Milton and Zamir White. James Cook is someone who now becomes even more imperative, just given as the wide receiver room becomes thinner and thinner. He's someone who you saw Georgia get involved on a limited basis last season. Now he becomes even more. And transitioning to the tight end room a little bit, I think one of the rooms there, one of the two most interesting guys to me right there, Kirby, interestingly enough, the first guy that he had mentioned when sort of talking about the tight ends was Brock Bowers. And Brock is a guy who I'm going to try and have a story on him in the coming week. He's a guy who didn't get a chance to play his senior season last year. California was wiped out. He reclassified, got to Georgia early, and is someone who is a better straight line speed acceleration athlete than a Darnell and might play. Now, they really don't have a player like him on this roster. And so with the injuries and the thinning out at wide receiver, especially that X position, which traditionally has been a little bit more physical, you think maybe that's a spot where Brock Bowers can chip in a little bit until this room gets a little bit healthier. I don't know if it is a full-blown, how, again, and we still don't know the extent of the Jermaine Burton injury. It could just be a hyperextended knee. It could obviously be the same injury that George Pickens had last week, and hopefully that is not the case there. So with Monken, again, if this wide receiver injury is as bad and injuries continue to pile up, it only is going to put more pressure on both Todd Monken and JT Daniels. So how that goes about rectifying itself over the course of the season is going to be really interesting. And Todd Monken is really going to, I think, have to make a name for himself now with, not that he hadn't already, but is someone who is going to have to get even more out of this Georgia offense, and even more of it falls on both JT Daniels and Todd Monken there. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out. I had a whole show planned for you guys. And really, this Jermaine Burton news has really just unfortunately wiped it out. So we'll open it up to questions and comments now. We might touch on some of the other things a little bit later. We might get to Trayvon here at the end a little bit. But again, to sort of recap and reset the news here, Jermaine Burton had to leave practice on Tuesday with a knee injury. He was carted off. The extent of the injury is not known yet. It could potentially be just a hyperextended knee. You can read the full story on DogNation.com. But again, for a wide receiver room that already lost its best player in George Pickens, you not lost, but Jermaine Burton was a guy who I think could really take that next leap and become a very solid number 2, along with Kearis Jackson. And 2 weeks ago, prior to the George Pickens injury, you felt a top 3 wide receiver core of George Pickens, Jermaine Burton, and Kearis Jackson was really strong and really solid. So now it'll be interesting to sort of see where this is and what happens from here. We're set to next speak and hear from Kirby Smart on Saturday. I wonder if that gets changed now. He had spoken on the last couple of Thursdays, so we'll keep you guys updated there. Foghorn Leghorn, just an incredible name, says, yeah, Georgia's going to have to use the tight ends a little bit more now, especially without Pickens, and maybe even doubly so if this Burton injury is as serious as it might seem to be. You have a guy like Darnell Washington who really seemed to make a leap there at the end of last season and could potentially become a bigger part of this Georgia offense, and it'll be interesting. Kirby had spoken about him before. He's just a totally different athlete. Kirby said he's pushing 275, 280, 6'7". It's basically what LeBron James would look like if he played on the football field. And from what I've heard and from what I've talked about with players, the mental side or the mental approach to the game is something where he's really improved and made strides this offseason. And it's something that's a little similar to what some of the offensive linemen have said, where getting to work hands-on with Todd Monken this year has just made it so much easier. They all feel a lot more comfortable. I'm going to play you the clip here, right here. Justin Schaefer and Warren McClendon sort of talking about year 2 with Todd Monken and just sort of how much better everything feels now that they actually get that hands-on instruction. So here's Justin Schaefer first and Warren McClendon right after.
The offense have got real comfortable with the playbook and stuff like that. And I feel like Coach Monken have really settled down and started to develop us as an offense.
Very comfortable with Coach Monken's system. This year is way better due to not having COVID and having to do everything over Zoom. We actually get hands-on and get to ask questions and stuff, and you get to draw it out on the board and stuff like that.
The offense.
Yeah, and so you hear them talk about the comfortability and confidence right there, and reading some of the comments and questions here. Again, resetting things. Jermaine Burton leaves practice today with a knee injury. We're waiting to hear the full extent of what it is and how long he might be out for. There are some people who cancel spring practice. Why do we do this? Why do we go through this? You can't have it both ways, where you so desperately want it, especially after losing it last season, and then get it this year. And football just turns out to be, it's a violent game. It's a game where injuries happen. And if you want spring practice, which so many people did, this is just sometimes the unintended consequences that come from that. Now, Amari Rodgers is someone at Clemson, tore his ACL in the spring of 2019, came back and played in Clemson's second game of the season there, 173 days between injury. Obviously, he didn't have the sort of season I think a lot of people thought he did, but he was still able to come back and be a contributor on that team. And stressing and resetting here, we don't know the full extent of Jermaine Burton's injury right now. We'll probably find more about that in the coming days. He did leave practice today. Comes a week after George Pickens tore his ACL into Georgia practice. So obviously it's a little concerning there. It'll be interesting to sort of see what Georgia does at receiver now with no George Pickens, with probably no Jermaine Burton for the rest of spring. The numbers in that room are getting a little thin, and especially when you have two guys already, Marcus Rosemy-Jack Saint and Jermaine Burton, who are already not going to be, I believe, full goes for for the G-Day game. You're looking at Kearis Jackson, Arian Smith. Let's see if I can get all these guys on one hand. Justin Robinson, Ladd McConkey, Jackson Meeks, and Adonai Mitchell. That's 6 guys. You have 6 healthy bodies right now at wide receiver because you have those 4 guys that are dealing with various injuries right now, and then you lose another 4 to the transfer portal. I do wonder now, this is something we had sort of talked about, earlier when transfer portal and what those additions might look like. I think now wide receiver becomes a much bigger position of need, especially if this Jermaine Burton injury appears to be serious. And does Georgia go after and sort of target in that realm, sort of similar like they're doing with the defensive back room? I would note Tyke Smith, a defensive back from West Virginia. He entered the transfer portal last week. That is a name to pay attention to with Georgia. I know he's not a true corner, but he is someone who is just clearly a really good football player. He's made various All-American teams, all Big 12 honors a season ago, and has playing experience with Jamal Adai. Someone who I think is probably a star in Georgia's system. Could potentially play some safety, and maybe you move Chris Smith out to corner, but I think he is someone who clearly would make the Georgia secondary better, and I think that is something to watch going forward as well in the coming days. What happens with his recruitment, and how quickly does that piece together, and does Georgia get involved and potentially land a really talented player who has significant playing experience and can sort of help that team there. But obviously I think that's a secondary story right now. The big story of tonight, Jermaine Burton leaves practice, suffers a knee injury. We don't yet fully know the extent of this injury. Mike Griffith reports that he did have to get carted off of practice this week, so that's obviously a very big concern. We'll sort of see and keep you guys monitored and updated about what comes next with that as far as recovery, what it means for the Georgia wide receiver room, and where things go from here. So we'll take some more of your questions. Obviously, we're scrapping most of this show now, and we'll try to answer the questions best we can and think about how, and again, I think the headline that I had for tonight still fits. How does Georgia now go about engineering enough production out of its wide receiver room with no George Pickens, and now potentially, who knows how long Jermaine Burton is out? We still don't know the extent of that injury. How does Georgia go about replacing its Jason Giambi and its Johnny Damon, to use a Moneyball reference? They've got to find a way to manufacture yards, catches, touchdowns. And I think the catches and yards, I think will be easy enough, especially as JT Daniels throws the ball a little bit more this season as he just gets more comfortable, and as Todd Monken, I believe, unveils the rest of his offense. I think the toughest number to replace with Pickens in particular is just the touchdowns and red zone threat. Just because, again, he had, I think, 4 touchdown catches over those final 4 games. That's 12 touchdowns over a 12-game season. And so you're going to have to find guys that can create mismatches in the red zone. The most obvious name that jumps to mind there is Darnell Washington, but he didn't have a touchdown catch at all last season. So obviously on paper and in theory, he makes a nice red zone threat, but until we actually go out and see him do it on the field, it's going to be something to monitor there. I think he jumps to mind. Arian Smith is obviously more of a downfield guy, deep shot, speed, and you wonder, does Georgia get creative a la what the Kansas City Chiefs and Tyreek Hill have sort of done, and they found ways to get him the ball in the red zone, sort of as a horizontal player that can turn up and get upfield and create plays there. Kyrus Jackson is someone who has proven to be a dependable third down option. And again, yes, the injuries to Pickens and Burton are obviously very concerning, but by the time August rolls around, again, we still don't know the seriousness of Burton's injury. He could be totally fine, and we'd get him back, and Georgia could get him back and be ready to go for the start of fall. You expect Marcus Rosemead, Jack Saint, and Dominic Blaylock to be fully ready to go, fully cleared for the start of practice there in August. So as bleak as Georgia's wide receiver room looks this spring, there's a chance it gets a lot better by the time August rolls around. Obviously, George Pickens I don't think will be back by then because I'm not a doctor, but my understanding of ACL injuries is it's probably closer to late November, early December is the maybe earliest you would project to see him back there. So we'll see on that. I know Kirby had brought up Devod Wilson as a guy who tore his ACL in the 2018 season. So Thomas Fansana asked, what about the Johnson kid? Yeah, Jalen Johnson. That's a guy who earned some reps and some snaps last year as a walk-on. I believe he's out of Peachtree Ridge. He's someone who is certainly going to see a lot more reps now and probably become a regular in that room as the extent of this injury gets known. He's someone who, again, he's impressed this Georgia team with his toughness, his knowledge of the playbook. He's sort of the stereotypical what you think of a walk-on, this gritty player that has really earned the respect of a lot of players and coaches, and he's someone who now figures to take on a bigger role with the numbers sort of getting a little dire there at that wide receiver position, at least in terms of scholarship numbers. Again, right now, Georgia only has 6 scholarship wide receivers that are at least healthy to our knowledge and extent. We'll wait to hear about what the latest is with Jermaine Burton, but it's Arian Smith, Kyrus Jackson, Justin Robinson, Ladd McConkey, Jackson Meeks, and Adonai Mitchell. And those last 2 guys are freshmen, and this is the really first experience going through Georgia practice and what that'll look like. So the numbers are really thin at wide receiver right now. It'll be interesting to see how that gets addressed for G-Day. Somebody in the comment section a while ago mentioned, do you maybe move Lassier Carroll to wide receiver? I expect James Cook to get a good bit more of reps out there. So Georgia, they're going to have to get creative. Do you a Brett Seither or a Brock Bowers? Do you try them out at wide receiver and sort of see what you have there in them? Georgia and Todd Monken, they're going to have to get creative with this wide receiver situation. It is not ideal. It is not what you want. But again, I think Monken, sort of like Billy Beane, is a really good mind, someone who I trust, someone who I think very highly of. I think if things go well and Georgia wide receivers stop getting injured, I think he is someone who could absolutely work himself into being a high major head coach, just given what he has already done in his career and how he has sort of helped change offense, or at least the offensive perception here at Georgia. So, and I forgot someone, Demetrius Robertson. He took advantage of that 6 year of eligibility. He's the 7th wide receiver. I have now forgotten him twice. He's someone that, excuse me, don't have the COVID. I got my first vaccine shot. Just a dry throat there. He is someone, Demetrius Robertson, who it's going to be really interesting now. Someone who, I don't know if trust is the right word, but someone who knows this playbook, knows this Georgia program, and is someone who, in past circumstances when called on, has made plays, just maybe not on the consistent level that we've always wanted to see. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what this does for Demetrius Robertson and how he might now get more playing time and become, I think, a bigger part of this Georgia offense, at least in the spring, as Georgia continues to deal with injury situation with George Pickens and Jermaine Burton there at wide receiver. So we'll sort of see what the latest is there. I see some people saying, get Jaden Hazelwood back. You guys do know that he missed parts of last season with a knee injury of his own. He is not still fully healthy or the 5-star player that he was at Oklahoma, and it sounds like he's going to get a real chance to make an impact this season there. And again, we're still waiting to hear that one-time transfer rule and what that looks like. The NCAA is set to meet after the Final Four later in April, and we'll get a better idea of what the transfer portal and what the NCAA transfer rules will look like. But as it still currently exists, and while I do understand there's the expectation that it does go away, there is still the 1-year exemption that players have to sit out, and Georgia only has 3 scholarships available, and one of those will likely go to a defensive back as Georgia tries to better that room there. You think a guy like Jack Podlesny is someone who could potentially go on scholarship. Georgia's got 3 scholarships to use. One of them, I think, will now be used on a wide receiver, and that is something I sort of believed even before the 2 injuries to Pickens and Burton. But now that position, as Kirby Smart has said, when it comes to the transfer portal, is a position of need, and wide receiver now is pretty clearly a big need. Obviously, resetting things here a little bit. Jermaine Burton suffers a knee injury, leaves practice. This is not at all what I thought I would be talking about tonight, but that's showbiz for you. So we touched a little bit on Todd Monken. I'll have to save some of the Trayvon Walker and national recruiting stuff I had planned for you guys later on. We'll take a few more of your comments and questions here as we sort of wind things down. We've gone about 30 minutes on something I don't think I had ever expected to get 30 minutes out of. My name is Connor Riley. We're sort of talking here latest with Georgia football. The latest news is not great news. Jermaine Burton suffers a knee injury. It's not, the extent of which it is not fully known yet. We'll talk to Kirby Smart later this week. I'm sure we'll get an answer as to how serious this knee injury is before then, but it comes a week after you lose George Pickens to an ACL injury, and just the tough beats seem to always roll on with this Georgia team. So let's see. Questions, comments, thoughts. Foster Moss, D-Rob got to play like the 10th year senior is. Yeah, he's in his 6th year of college eligibility. He was a recruit in Kirby Smart's first recruiting cycle, that 2016 class. He's now going into his 4th year at Georgia. He taking advantage of that extra year of eligibility. So, sort of it'll be interesting to see how this affects D-Rob and how he develops and what kind of usage he gets in this Georgia offense this year. Let's see, comments and questions. Yeah, G Bama Boy brings up, and Mike had sort of touched on this in the piece, which you can read on Dog Nation. Hyperextended knee. And again, if that's all it is, and there's no structural ligament damage, he's out for the rest of spring. But you feel much, much better about the long-term prognosis there. Again, this is sort of a situation where until we get more information, it's always just easy to sort of assume the worst here. But if it's only a hyperextended knee, I think that's a big win for Georgia. He'll obviously miss the remainder of spring practice. That's probably about a month-long injury, give or take. But if it's only a hyperextended knee, which what Mike Griffith is reporting it could potentially be, I think that is a win for Georgia in the sense that it could have been much worse. So if it's only a hyperextended knee, that's roughly about, in season, maybe you could play on it 2 weeks. Maybe it could be 6 weeks, depending on how it heals and how Jermaine reacts to it. But that's usually at least a month-long injury. So he would join Kenny McIntosh, who had an elbow injury as well. So we'll sort of keep that in mind. And again, Dog Nation will have you plugged in the latest of as far as what it means for Burton and sort of what that road to recovery looks like. So, Rodney, I'm not going to read that comment, Rodney. I think that's a little too pessimistic. But obviously, yeah, Georgia now sort of the Burton injury on top of the Pickens injury. It's certainly scary might not be the right word, but it's a worrying situation. And unfortunately, injuries just tend to happen in football sometimes. And it seems like Georgia's just in a little bad luck right now. Hopefully that means by the time the spring rolls or the fall rolls around, they'll be in a better spot. You think back to that 2019 season, Georgia wasn't very deep at the wide receiver position, and then it got snake bitten by injuries. Lawrence Cager suffered a season-ending, I believe, either ankle or shoulder or ankle injury. Let's use our words, Connor. Dominic Blaylock tears his ACL in the SEC championship game in the first quarter against LSU. Kyrus Jackson breaks his hand and then has, I believe, an ankle injury later on in the season as well. So Georgia just sort of snake bitten there. But I think compared to that 2019 season, you feel a lot better about what Georgia has at this wide receiver position in 2021. And Todd Monken's a really, really good coach, and this will be sort of my parting thought here. He's a former wide receiver coach. If there's anyone that can get the most out of what is the current situation in the Georgia wide receiver room, I do believe it is Todd Pickens. We sort of touched on Billy Beane at the top of the night, and obviously, sort of like Georgia, the one thing that has eluded Billy Beane is a championship. But I would also point out that the Boston Red Sox in 2004, and just about every team after, has adopted Billy Beane's policies. The Boston Red Sox in 2004 won the World Series using largely the same principles that Billy Beane had used. So if Georgia is able to absorb the Pickens loss, and we'll wait and see what this Jermaine Burton loss looks like, if they're able to absorb that, I think they're going to be just fine at the wide receiver position, especially with some of the talent they have both there and in the tight end and running back room. So that'll do it for us tonight. You'll have Jeff tomorrow with Before the Hazards. Big recruiting past week, 3 commitments, 2 of them out of state, 2 of them top 50 guys, a 5-star in Malachi Starks, a 4-star in Jalen Walker, and a 4-star running back in Jordan James. We're going to do Cover 4 on Thursday. I'm sure by that point in time, we'll have a ton of more news to talk about, specifically with Jermaine Burton. Brandon Adams every Monday through Friday, obviously, and then Mike Griffith does his On the Beats on Monday night. But wrapping things up here again, Jermaine Burton leaves practice with a knee injury. We do not know the extent of it. Mike Griffith reporting could potentially just be a hyperextended knee, which would be, I think, a big win for Georgia. But for Connor Riley, which is my name, I am signing off for the night. This has been Connor Uncovered. Bad news, potentially. But thanks all for tuning in. Thanks for your questions. I really appreciate it. Have a great Tuesday night.